Andrew Castellano had analyzed over 10,000 voices in his 23-year career as a forensic audio specialist. He'd testified in 47 criminal cases where his voice biometric analysis had put murderers behind bars, exonerated the innocent, and proved beyond scientific doubt that a voice captured on a 911 call or a ransom recording belonged to one specific human being on this planet. His work had been cited by the FBI, accepted in federal courts, and peer-reviewed by the most rigorous acoustic scientists in the world. So when his software froze on March 14, 2019, displaying a 94.7% biometric match between two supposedly different men, his first reaction wasn't excitement or conspiracy theories. It was genuine fear that his entire career had been built on faulty science. The comparison should have been routine. A client had hired him to debunk internet conspiracy theories for a documentary about celebrity death hoaxes, and Elvis Presley's supposed survival was at the top of the list. The request was simple enough: run voice analysis on Bob Joyce, a pastor from Arkansas who conspiracy theorists claimed was actually Elvis Presley living under an assumed identity. Castellano had laughed when he took the job. He'd done dozens of these, comparing alleged Tupac recordings to random rappers, analyzing supposed Michael Jackson phone calls, running tests on people who swore their neighbor was actually Jim Morrison. Every single time, the science had been definitive. The matches never exceeded 40%, and that was being generous with family members who shared genetic vocal structures. So Castellano loaded the baseline samples into his system. Clean recordings of Elvis Presley from 1977, just months before his death. Gospel performances where Elvis's voice was isolated, unprocessed, and captured on professional equipment that gave perfect clarity for acoustic analysis. Then he pulled Bob Joyce sermon recordings from YouTube, audio ripped from church services where the pastor sang hymns and preached to his small Arkansas congregation. The software would measure laryngeal anatomy, analyze formant frequencies, track pitch modulation patterns, calculate vibrato speed, and map the unique breath control signatures that make every human voice as distinctive as a fingerprint. Within minutes, the algorithm would spit out a match percentage. Castellano would write up his findings confirming Bob Joyce was just a pastor who happened to sound a bit like Elvis, and he'd collect his fee. Except the software didn't spit out 40%. It didn't even spit out 60%. The screen filled with waveform overlays that matched with such precision that Castellano's hands went cold. 94.7% biometric correspondence. He stared at the number like it was written in a language he didn't understand. In forensic voice analysis, anything above 85% is considered a definitive match, the kind of evidence that sends people to death row. Identical twins, who share the exact same genetic code, typically match between 85 and 89%, because even they develop slightly different vocal patterns based on life experiences, injuries, and speech habits. But 94.7% meant these weren't just similar voices. According to every scientific principle Castellano had built his career on, this was the same voice. His first assumption was software corruption. Maybe a bad update, maybe a glitch in the algorithm, maybe his system had finally given up after processing thousands of comparisons. So he shut everything down, restarted from scratch, and ran the test again using a different Elvis baseline. This time, he used a 1968 recording from the Comeback Special, a full 9 years earlier than the previous sample. If Bob Joyce was just a sound alike, the comparison would fall apart when tested against a younger Elvis with a different vocal maturity. The software calculated for 7 minutes, processing terabytes of acoustic data, mapping every microscopic variation in pitch and resonance. When the results populated, Castellano felt his stomach drop. 96.2% match. He ran the test 17 times over the next 6 hours. He used Elvis recordings from 1956, raw tracks from Sun Studios where the King was barely 21 years old. He used informal recordings, live concerts, studio outtakes, and private conversations that had been leaked over the years. He pulled different Bob Joyce samples from different years, different settings, different emotional contexts, sermon audio from 2010, gospel singing from 2017, a rare recording from a Bible study in 2020 where Joyce's voice was barely audible over background conversation. Every single test came back with matches between 91.2% and 96.8%. The consistency was what terrified him most. If this was coincidence, if Bob Joyce just happened to sound freakishly similar to Elvis, the percentages would vary wildly depending on which samples were compared. But the matches held steady across different decades, different recording qualities, different contexts. Castellano sat alone in his lab at 2 a.m, surrounded by monitors displaying waveform analysis that his brain refused to accept. He'd built his entire professional reputation on one foundational truth: voice biometrics don't lie. The mathematical algorithms that measured the physical properties of human vocal cords, the resonance chambers of sinuses and throat structure, the neurological patterns that controlled breath and pitch, these weren't subjective interpretations. This was hard science, as reliable as DNA evidence and far harder to fake. You could disguise your voice, adopt an accent, or mimic someone's speech patterns, but you couldn't change your laryngeal anatomy. You couldn't restructure your formant frequencies. You couldn't retrain your autonomic breathing patterns that had been hardwired since childhood. What made the analysis even more disturbing was a specific anomaly Castellano noticed in both voice prints. Elvis Presley had a documented condition called bilateral vocal fold paresis, a slight paralysis of the vocal cords that created a distinctive vibrato and required specific compensatory breathing techniques to maintain pitch control. It was rare, occurring in less than 0.3% of the population, and it left an unmistakable signature in voice analysis. The tremolo speed, the micro-corrections and sustained notes, the way air passed through partially paralyzed tissue, all of it showed up in the spectrograms like a fingerprint. And Bob Joyce's voice showed the exact same condition. Not similar. Not reminiscent of. The exact same bilateral paresis, compensated for with the exact same techniques, producing the exact same acoustic anomalies. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Castellano made a decision that night that would change his life. He didn't go public with his findings. He didn't call the documentary producers or write up a report. Instead, he started investigating Bob Joyce with the same forensic precision he'd use on a criminal suspect. He needed to find the crack in this impossible facade. The evidence that would explain how two different men could share a voice that science said was biologically unique. What he found instead was a trail of evidence that led back to August 1977, to a baptismal record in Arkansas, and to a name that connected Bob Joyce directly to Elvis Presley's inner circle. A witness signature on a church document that should have been impossible. A signature that would crack this conspiracy wide open and force Castellano to confront a truth more terrifying than any murder case he'd ever worked: that Elvis Presley might have successfully faked his own death and had been hiding in plain sight for 42 years. The baptismal certificate Dr. Castellano found in the Arkansas State Records Archive was dated October 22, 1978, 14 months after Elvis Presley's death. It documented the spiritual rebirth of one Robert Allen Joyce at a small Baptist church outside Little Rock, a ceremony that marked his official entry into the congregation and his new life as a devoted servant of God. What made Castellano's blood run cold wasn't the date or the location. It was the name of the officiating minister, Reverend James Hamill, the same pastor who had baptized a young Elvis Aaron Presley in Tupelo, Mississippi, back in 1948. Hamill had been Elvis's childhood spiritual guide, the man who'd first taught the future king about gospel music and the redemptive power of faith. And according to every public record, James Hamill had died in 1975, 3 years before he supposedly performed Bob Joyce's baptism. But it was the witness signature that made Castellano realize he'd stumbled into something far deeper than a simple identity question. Scrawled at the bottom of the certificate in shaky handwriting was a name that sent him down a research rabbit hole that would consume the next 8 months of his life. Elvis Presley, Elvis's uncle. The man who'd worked the gates at Graceland for decades, who'd been part of Elvis's inner circle, who'd been one of the last family members to see Elvis alive on August 16, 1977. Vester had died in 1997, but in 1978, he'd apparently traveled to Arkansas to witness the baptism of a man who, according to conspiracy theorists, and now according to forensic voice analysis, might actually be his nephew living under an assumed name. Tracking down someone who could explain that signature became Castellano's obsession. Vester's widow had passed years ago, and most of his children had either died or disappeared from public life, wanting nothing to do with the endless circus of Elvis obsession that had consumed their family for decades. But Castellano finally found a lead through a Memphis genealogy researcher. Vester's daughter Patsy, Elvis's first cousin, was still alive at 81 years old. Living in a nursing facility outside Knoxville, Tennessee, getting her to talk would require showing up in person, and Castellano knew he'd have one chance before she either shut down completely or had him thrown out by security. When he arrived at her room on a gray afternoon in November 2019, Paty Presley was sitting by the window in a wheelchair, staring out at bare trees swaying in cold wind. She didn't turn when he introduced himself, didn't acknowledge his presence even when he explained why he'd come. For 10 full minutes she sat in silence while Castellano laid out his evidence. The voice analysis, the baptismal record, her father's signature connecting the family to Bob Joyce. Finally, she spoke without looking at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Some secrets are kept for protection, not deception. You need to understand that before we go any further. The hostility in her tone made it clear she'd spent decades being harassed by conspiracy theorists, tabloid journalists, and amateur investigators, convinced they'd cracked the mystery of Elvis's death. She'd probably told 1,000 people to leave her alone, to let her cousin rest in peace, to stop dragging the family through endless speculation and grief. But something in Castellano's approach must have been different. Maybe the scientific precision of his evidence or the genuine confusion in his voice rather than the triumphant certainty of a conspiracy theorist. After another long silence, Patsy turned her wheelchair to face him, and the look in her eyes wasn't anger. It was exhaustion mixed with something that looked almost like relief. What she told him over the next 2 hours would reframe everything the world thought it knew about August 1977. 3 weeks before Elvis's death, Patsy had been summoned to Graceland along with several other trusted family members for what was described as an emergency meeting. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had gathered them in the music room with the doors locked and the security staff dismissed. The conversation that followed wasn't about funeral arrangements for someone who was dying. It was about logistics for someone who needed to disappear. Elvis was present for part of the meeting, bloated and exhausted, but clear-eyed in a way Patsy hadn't seen him in years. He told them he'd come to understand that his life as Elvis Presley had become a death sentence, that the contractual obligations crushing him would never end until he was literally worked to death on stage. The financial prison Elvis described that night was more sophisticated than simple debt or bad management. Colonel Tom Parker had structured deals that gave him 50% of everything Elvis earned. But the real trap was deeper. There were merchandising contracts that extended 20 years into the future, Vegas performance agreements with penalty clauses that would bankrupt the estate if Elvis couldn't fulfill them, and a web of business arrangements that essentially meant Elvis's only value was as a performing machine. He tried to break free, tried to fire Parker, tried to renegotiate, but every legal avenue ended with the same conclusion: the contracts were ironclad, and the only way they terminated was with Elvis's death. So Elvis, with the help of Vernon and a small circle of family who still loved him more than they loved his money, began planning exactly that. Patsy described the plan with the kind of detail that made it clear she'd been carrying this weight for over 40 years. They would fake Elvis's death using a body double, someone who'd recently died of natural causes whose family could be compensated generously for their cooperation. The initial plan involved a wax figure for the viewing to avoid anyone getting too close, then a switch to an actual body for the burial. Medical records would be falsified by doctors who were already on Elvis's payroll and had been complicit in the prescription drug abuse that was slowly killing him anyway. Memphis officials who owed the Presley family favors from decades of economic benefit Elvis had brought to the city would look the other way, and Elvis himself would be relocated somewhere he could live quietly, anonymously, and pursue the one thing that had brought him genuine peace in his final years: his growing faith and his desire to serve God without the corruption of fame. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The part that broke Patsy emotionally as she recounted it was Elvis's phone call to her the night before his death. It was late past midnight, and his voice had the calm certainty of someone who'd made peace with an irreversible decision. He told her that tomorrow he was either dying or being born again, that both things could be true at the same time, that the Elvis she'd grown up with was gone regardless of what happened to his body. He thanked her for loving him when he was just a poor kid from Tupelo, before the world turned him into something he never asked to be. Then he told her she'd know if the plan worked by watching for signs. For a man who looked like him appearing somewhere quiet, somewhere focused on God instead of gold records. 14 months later, Patsy received a phone call from her father Vester asking her to pray for a man named Bob Joyce who was beginning a ministry in Arkansas. She understood immediately. And when Vester asked her not to attend the baptism because too many Presleys in one place would draw attention, she knew the resurrection had been successful. Bob Joyce appeared in public records in 1978 with no history, no birth certificate, no paper trail before that year. But what Castellano discovered next made the conspiracy undeniable. Property records showing that the small house Bob Joyce lived in during his early ministry years had been purchased through a trust connected to Vernon Presley. And then Patsy showed Castellano something she'd kept hidden for decades, something that could have exposed everything years ago, but that she'd protected out of love for her cousin. It was a photograph from 1981, slightly faded, but clear enough to stop Castellano's heart. Vernon Presley, who'd officially died in 1979, was standing next to a man who looked exactly like an older, thinner Elvis, both of them smiling at what appeared to be a small birthday gathering. The man who resembled Elvis had his arm around Vernon's shoulder, and the expression on both their faces was something Patsy described as peace, the kind neither man had known during Elvis's years of fame. She wouldn't say where the photo was taken or who else was present, but she confirmed what Castellano had already begun to suspect: Vernon hadn't died in 1979. He'd lived until at least 1982, long enough to see his son safely established in his new life, long enough to know the escape plan had worked. Doctor? Castellano returned to the science with a different mission now. He wasn't trying to debunk a conspiracy theory anymore. He was trying to understand how a voice could survive death, how the unique biological signature of Elvis Presley's larynx could still be producing sound waves 4 decades after the world watched his funeral on television. The answer lay in the physics of human vocal anatomy, in measurements so precise that they'd been used to convict criminals in courts around the world. Voice biometrics doesn't measure style or impression. It measures the actual physical structure of your throat, the spacing of your vocal folds, the resonance chambers formed by your sinus cavities, and the shape of your skull. These are things you're born with, things that remain consistent from age 20 to age 80, things that can't be taught or imitated or faked. When Castellano went back through his analysis with the knowledge that he might actually be comparing the same person at different ages, the evidence became even more damning. Both voices showed the bilateral vocal fold paresis he'd initially flagged, that rare partial paralysis affecting less than 0.3% of the population. But it wasn't just the presence of the condition that mattered. It was how both men compensated for it. When you have weakened vocal folds, you unconsciously develop techniques to maintain pitch control, specific breathing patterns that support your voice when the muscles can't. These compensatory behaviors are as unique as the condition itself, developed through years of singing and speaking, hardwired into your neurological control of breath and sound. Elvis and Bob Joyce didn't just share the same vocal anomaly. They developed the exact same unconscious techniques to work around it. Techniques that would take decades to ingrain and couldn't be deliberately copied even if someone knew what to look for. Castellano created a spectrographic analysis that would become his most compelling evidence. He took Elvis's 1977 performance of How Great Thou Art, isolated the vocal track, and mapped every frequency, every harmonic overtone, every microscopic variation in the waveform. Then he did the same with Bob Joyce's 2016 rendition of the same hymn, recorded in his Arkansas church with completely different equipment and acoustic environment. When he overlaid the two spectrograms, adjusting only for the recording quality differences, the waveforms matched with a precision that made his hands shake. 96.2% overlay accuracy. The peaks and valleys of sound, the unique harmonic signatures, the vibrato speed measured down to the millisecond, all of it aligned in a way that voice science said was impossible between two different human beings. He knew this evidence needed verification beyond his own lab, so Castellano submitted his findings to 3 independent forensic audio facilities, all of them FBI certified and regularly used in federal criminal cases. He sent them the raw data without context, just the voice samples and a request for biometric comparison analysis. All 3 labs came back with the same conclusion within weeks. The voices showed a biometric match consistent with the same individual recorded at different ages. One lab noted that the slight deepening of Bob Joyce's voice compared to Elvis's 1977 recordings was exactly consistent with normal vocal aging over a 40-year period. Another lab flagged the bilateral paresis and the identical compensatory patterns, noting in their preliminary report that this alone would be sufficient for identity confirmation in a criminal case. But when Castellano asked all 3 labs to formalize their findings in official reports that he could cite publicly, everything changed. The first lab suddenly claimed their analysis had been preliminary and they couldn't stand behind the results without further testing that would cost another $50,000. The second lab stopped returning his calls entirely, and when he finally reached the director, he was told that the facility had a policy against being involved in celebrity conspiracy cases regardless of the scientific merit. The third lab was the most honest. The lead analyst told Castellano off the record that they'd been contacted by attorneys representing Elvis Presley Enterprises and strongly encouraged to decline any further involvement in the analysis. There was no explicit threat, just a professional suggestion that continued participation might affect the lab's relationship with certain entertainment industry clients who provided substantial revenue. Bob Joyce was who Elvis Presley had always wanted to be. The journal also contained something else that made Castellanos' hands tremble as Patsy described it. Elvis had written explicit instructions for someone to verify his identity after enough time had passed that the revelation couldn't destroy the plan. He'd written about the bilateral paresis in his voice, about how that rare condition meant that anyone with access to voice biometric technology could eventually prove the truth. He'd written that he hoped someday science would catch up with his secret, that the technology would exist to prove what his family knew. It was almost as if Elvis had anticipated that 40 years in the future, a forensic audio specialist would run a routine analysis and freeze in disbelief at numbers that defied explanation. As if he'd known that eventually, the voice he'd been given would tell the truth he'd spent a lifetime trying to hide. Members of Bob Joyce's congregation began reaching out to Castellano after word spread through the conspiracy theory community that he'd been silenced. They described their pastor with a reverence that went beyond normal religious respect. They talked about his supernatural knowledge of Memphis history from the 1950s, how he'd referenced specific neighborhoods and details from that era with the casual certainty of someone who'd lived there. They mentioned how he'd react with visible emotion whenever certain Elvis songs came up, how he'd leave services abruptly if someone inadvertently played one of the King's recordings. One longtime church member described attending a Bible study where Bob Joyce was discussing the spiritual dangers of celebrity, and he'd suddenly stopped mid-sentence, stared out the window, and whispered, "I had everything the world told me to want, and it nearly killed me." The medical evidence surfaced next. A retired physician from Arkansas who'd treated Bob Joyce for a chronic colon condition in 1983 eventually came forward to Castellano, now in his 80s and past the point of caring about non-disclosure agreements. He confirmed that Joyce suffered from the exact same intestinal issues that Elvis Presley had battled for decades, the same rare condition documented in Elvis's medical records. More significant was dental records. A former dental assistant who'd worked on both men decades apart recognized the identical dental structure, the same bite pattern, the same rare configuration of molars that appeared in Elvis's 1977 X-rays and Bob Joyce's 1995 dental work. Castellano also tracked down a former Memphis police officer who'd been on duty the morning of August 16, 1977. Now 86 years old and living quietly in retirement, the officer had finally decided that whatever oath he'd taken deserved to be broken. He described being ordered to escort what he thought was a deceased body to the medical examiner's office at 3 a.m, hours before Elvis's death was announced to the public. But the body was already in full rigor mortis, impossible for someone who'd just died. Officials were present who had no reason to be there. The entire scene had the choreography of something carefully planned rather than a medical emergency, and he'd been handed $10,000 in cash and told to forget the night ever happened. By 2023, Bob Joyce was 88 years old, the exact age Elvis would have been. He continued his ministry in Arkansas, still refusing all media contact, still avoiding photographs, still preaching sermons about redemption and the spiritual danger of seeking recognition. The consistency of his identity, his theology, his personal habits, all of it matched perfectly with what Elvis had written in that journal about the life he wanted to live. Then, in November 2023, a package arrived at Dr. Castellano's office with no return address, postmarked from Arkansas. Inside was a single handwritten note on church stationery. The message read, "Some voices are meant to shake the world. Mine shook it long enough. Now it whispers to those who need to hear God, not a ghost. The man you're looking for died in 1977. The man I am was born in 1978. Both can be true. The note was unsigned. But when Castellano compared the handwriting to samples of Elvis Presley's personal letters from 1976, held in the Graceland archives, the match was undeniable. The same loops, the same pressure patterns, the same distinctive way of forming the letter E that appeared in every love letter Elvis had ever written to Priscilla. The evidence is undeniable, but the truth remains hidden. If you want to see the actual voice analysis comparisons, the documents, and the interviews that mainstream media refuses to cover, check out the next video on your screen. Subscribe now, because this story is far from over. The king might still be among us.